Welcome to a new episode of Budapest, my podcast on the crisis of liberal democracies. I'm Ivan Scalfarotto and my guest today is Catherine Fieschi. Catherine is a leading European politics expert and one of the most influential analysts of populism and authoritarianism in advanced democracies. She's the founder of Counterpoint, a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe, a fellow at the Robert Schuman Centre of the European University Institute in Florence, and the author of Populocracy, The Tyranny of Authenticity and the Rise of Populism. She's one of the sharpest readers of how populism reshapes democracies from within and of what it takes to push back. And now, let's get started. Welcome, Catherine Fieschi. Thanks for joining me. And the first question for you will be the question with which we open all the episodes of Budapest, which is, where is your Budapest? Budapest, to me, is the frontier between liberal democracies and illiberal democracies. I noticed that when I marched for Pride at Budapest, and of course the recent events in Budapest made it very clear that the line is thin. So where do you see that frontier falling these days?
Right. So I think what's interesting is that your frontier is a slightly geographical one because in part where Budapest is located. And my frontier is a kind of almost temporal one, and it's Paris. It's Paris because I think that we are in a moment on the brink in Paris. Everything is still democratic, representative, messy, but we're still in the realm of representative democracy. But nevertheless, we are in a moment where it's fundamentally challenged, and the elections that will happen in France next year in 2027 could show how thin actually, as you say, the frontier between authoritarianism and representative democracy actually is.
Now, you wrote a beautiful book called Populocracy, and in that book you say that populism is a real ideology, is something thick, is not something you need to attach to something else, it's a sort of a self-standing position. So why do you think this matters? Why is it important to say, listen, guys, this is not something you need to attach to something else, it's a self-standing ideology? Why do you define authoritarianism like an ideology?
So I think that the more I study populism, the more I have doubts about my own understanding of it. Is it really a fully fledged ideology? But the reason I say this is that I think that if you reduce populism to something that is just like a style of communication, and you see it as attached to other ideologies like socialism, for example, or like fascism, for example, then I think you lose two things that are important. First of all, you lose the fact that there is something unique about populism, which is that the dividing line really is between the people, which is something that most populists struggle to construct, but they try very hard to construct. But also it's all of the elites, right? So it's not just the capitalist elite, it's also the media, it's intellectuals, it's the liberals. And I think that this makes it fundamentally different. And keeping that difference in mind means that you then start using the word populism a little bit more carefully, and you stop, people often make that confusion between popular and populist. And the fact is that populism is something more specific than that. And then just quickly, I think that there's another reason why it's important to take populism seriously enough as an ideological form. And I think that is because it forces us to unpack what democracy is. I often hear people saying, there's the Democrats on one side and the populists on the other side. And that is a very big mistake, because populism advocates a form of democracy. It's just a form of democracy that is very, very problematic. And I think that in the times that we're living in, we have to be able to specify what kind of democracy we want, right? We don't want a populist democracy. We want a different kind of democracy. We need to be able to specify what is good about it, the checks and balances, the representativeness. And actually taking populism seriously forces us to look at democracy, I think, much more subtly and much more seriously, because we need to right now.
But do you think that this sort of an ideology has some common traits that you would notice happening everywhere? So do you think there's a fil rouge bringing together the various Orbáns or the Fizos or the Le Pens? Are there some traits you would describe as always or commonly seen in illiberal people like these?
Absolutely, and there are very much common traits. One is a rejection of pluralism and a rejection of diversity, because this concept of the people is a rather homogenous and homogenizing concept, and I think that they all share this. The second is the sense of a natural order, an immutable order, and therefore a nostalgia for more conservative societies where the hierarchy of individuals and groups is much more set. And then I think that there is a real rejection of institutions, and in particular representative institutions. I think the hallmark of populism is very much this idea that there has to be a direct connection between the leader and his or her people, and therefore they privilege things like referendums, they privilege direct forms of politics rather than the kind of more sophisticated types of institutions that in our contemporary democracies tend to ensure that minorities, different voices get represented, right? So there is a at the heart of populism, there is a version of democracy that is strict majoritarianism, right? And therefore a disdain for the right of minorities. And I think that they all share this.
And would you also see a common modus operandi? I think, for example, of the control of the press, of the judiciary first, and then the control of the press. Have you seen, again, a fil rouge in the way they try to establish themselves and then reinforce their regimes?
Absolutely, and I think that the first thing that they try to do, and I mean, here, we have such a gigantic, almost a caricature example in the United States, carrying out the playbook. But it's true that Trump very much also borrowed from Orbán's playbook, and that playbook was about, first of all, controlling the media, then trying to overwhelm the judiciary, and then actually change the constitution and the laws in ways that would ensure an unfair advantage for his party, for example, in the case of Orbán, based on the laws that he passed in 2011. The fact that Magyar needed to have a 2/3 majority, regardless of whether or not he won the popular vote, in order to actually have an impact. All of this is about consolidating a system. So first the communications, then the judiciary, and then the electoral institutions. We can see that this is something that is often the playbook.
And you also use an expression that I loved preparing this interview, which is Ju-Jitsu politics. And
Yes.
I understand you mean that basically it's like a move in this martial art where you basically use the strength of your enemy or the other part in order to use it against them in a way. How can you help me and our viewers to understand better what you mean?
Yes, and I think I use the term Ju-Jitsu politics in the book and I use it in two ways. One is that I think that populism uses the strengths of democracy against itself, right? So it's a perversion of democracy from the inside, if you like, and they tend to use all our best lines, to use all our best moves against us who are sort of liberal institutionalist Democrats. And then there's a different way in which I wanted to use the term Ju-Jitsu politics in the book, and that was that we struggle to counter populism. We struggle to figure out how to take them on. They lie, so we try and use data. The more we try and use data, the more we irritate the voters who think that we're nitpicking and we're over complexifying in order to confuse them. They lie, and we try and tell the truth. And so my recommendation was to turn the moves back on the populists. If the populists want radical authenticity, if they want to claim the idea that they're going to have a direct relationship with the people, we have to do a little bit more of that in order to counter them. And also, and this is something that I'm working on more closely right now, we have to make sure that we avail ourselves of all of the instruments and the tools that the populists are so good at using, and namely, weaponizing social media, weaponizing even the media itself. And I'm not suggesting in any way that we take the low road, right, or that we become as bad as them. It's not a question of content. It's a question of using those means, I think, social media means and traditional media means a little bit more effectively in order to counter them.
Can you expand a bit on that? Because as a politician, sometimes I struggle. I will make my confession here, my number 2 coming out. To be honest with you, I stopped going to TV as often as I used to do before, because there has been a time where I literally found myself in a TV studio asking myself, what am I doing here? Because it was very clear that the anchor person was not interested at all to make sure that I could express my positions, and even less than the viewers could form their opinions. I mean, the whole TV show was not about information. It was very much about setting up a show. So the more people were arguing with each other, the more people were shouting to each other, the more confusion was happening in the studio, the more the anchor person seemed happy that their audience would go up.
Yeah.
And so I ended up, and I would like to have your advice also, because I ended up thinking, Ivan, you're an MP, you're paid to speak in the parliament. The parliament is the place where whatever you say remains noted in the transcripts. Of course, there's no interruption. I can organize a flow of my thoughts. Also, the solemnity of the hall where things happen, I think, gives some more nobility to what we say in the parliament. But on the other hand, I agree with you. You leave space to others this way. So, what should a sensible liberal like me do in this situation?
I have to, I have huge admiration for the fact that you are doing it, right? So it's very easy to give this sort of advice from where I'm sitting, and I realize that. But where I'm sitting also gives me, a kind of a distance, if you like, and I've been studying this for a long time, and there's a couple of things that I think are important. One is that, of course, you have to choose your context carefully, right? I mean, there are some television shows that even as an analyst, I simply, I will not go because it's rigged, right? It's absolutely rigged in order to have an argument. But I think that what the populists often do much better than we do is they tell a good story. We have trouble telling a good story. Now, their good story can be a bunch of lies. It can be, it doesn't have to be a very sophisticated story. But, they have a way of saying, you were promised this. These people did not deliver it. Look at them. They're all working together for themselves as a caste, as an elite. Meanwhile, your purchasing power is going down and your housing costs are going up. This is all the fault of X, Y, Z, and we propose to pull out of Europe, for example, right? Or we propose to transform Europe from within. As liberals, I think that we often get caught up in a lot of nuances, and these nuances are important, but they're not important to make every step of the way. There are areas and there are contexts where actually I think telling a compelling story, is something that we have failed to do. And as liberals, as progressives, I think we need to spend a lot more time on that, because a good story can be told quickly, right? A good story can be told bypassing an argument, and I think that we haven't been very, very good on that lately. And then I think that there's another point here, and I know that everybody points to him, and we don't know yet whether he will be good or not. But there is something about the way that Mamdani, I think, ran his campaign, which, aside from the fact that it was he was a New Yorker running a campaign in New York, all of this is very contextualized, but he did not shy away from who he was. He did use the authenticity point, right? He said, look, I know I'm young, I know I'm a socialist, and I know I'm a Muslim, and I'm not apologizing for any of these, right? There's something very straightforward about this, and that actually robs, the populists of their claim to being the only authentic politicians, right? And I think that is something which we need to stick to. We know that the attacks will come if we do this, but I think that, a very authentic stance is also a very good way of, giving yourself some Teflon, right? This is truly who you are, right? Take it or leave it. But I think it's a way of, of turning that authenticity move back against them. They turned it against us. It's time to reclaim it.
Yeah, even if what I find challenging is of course that we always try to be reasonable, and to highlight also the pros and cons that you will find in any decision you make. And that there's one, I mean, sometimes I feel I agree with you that it's not just about democracy, it's the concept of liberal democracy, and which is different from the democracy per se, right? And I find there's a great definition, in my opinion, of what liberal democracy is in the Article 1 of Italian Constitution, because the Article 1 says that sovereignty belongs to the people. But then it says people exercise sovereignty within the forms and the limits of the Constitution. And I love the idea that popular sovereignty has limits. For example, in the respect of minorities, there are things that cannot be decided just by using the principle of majority. There are things that we cannot do even if most of our population would like to do so, because then they're not in line with our democracies. But then explaining to people that there are limits and that there are challenges in everything we do. Staying in Europe, yes, it is challenging. Sometimes it is challenging. It means finding an agreement with 26 other countries, but is it good or bad? It is good. Yeah. But of course, it's much easier to, complain, to shout, to scream, and to say to the people, if the majority of the people wants this, and whatever stays in the way should be swept away.
Yeah. No, I agree with you, and it goes back to my point about, I think, the story, that the red line, that red thread, rather, not a red line, but that thread needs to be, a relatively simple story, because in a story the facts stick, right? If you give facts as justifications, one after the other, let me tell you the 10 ways in which Europe has made our life better over the past whatever the years, right? That's not gonna cut it. But if you tell a story into which you put some of the crucial facts, then somehow I think it sticks. It's the same, I would argue, about democracy, that idea of the limits, the fact that sometimes you need to challenge and so on. It's that idea that democracy is actually hard work. Democracy doesn't save you doing the work. It demands more work from you. But I think that, we're at a time in European history where we need, we've talked so much about the European construction, and I think that we're now at a time where we need to think about a different kind of reconstruction of European democracy. And the notion of reconstruction that we had in the 1950s, when we first emerged as a European economic community, and then a community, and so on and so forth. Okay, now we're in union. But that union is being eroded by a number of forces. What kind of reconstruction do we need to put forward now? And is that potentially the narrative that we need to put forward, of why would we put in this work? How do we envisage it? What do we need from you? I've always found that, one of the attractive things about populism, it doesn't ask anything of anyone. You just have to be the people, right? But at the same time, I think that there's a different way of talking to citizens, not the people, but the citizens. And it's to ask them to contribute, right? Not just in taxes. I remember I was very, very struck by some conversation groups that I had in the United States under the first Obama term. And it was really interesting because the disappointment of people with respect to Obama, a whole group said to me, he doesn't ask anything of us. We were ready to do things, but he didn't ask anything of us, right? And I think that we have to remind ourselves that, very many citizens they need to be asked and told how they can help in this kind of reconstructive, rethought, reimagined moment for Europe. I know that it's easier said than done, but I'm still convinced that the only way that we can make our points about the pros and the cons is by telling a story. Why are we so bad at it? Why can't we do it?
It's a good question, because the point is that the story we have is a great story. Because
Yes.
if we think of what Europe, the European Union and the economic community before that provided us with, peace, stability, prosperity, welfare state that has worked, the rule of law. So I'm always surprised being being an Italian, how many commentators, how many people in TV, and how much, a big part, what a big part of the public opinion stands behind Putin and Russia, and doesn't stand by the Ukrainians and their desire to basically adopt our lifestyle, because the issue there on the ground is that the Ukrainians would like to live the European style, and Putin thinks they should live his way, and it is very weird to listen to Italian fellows or other people around Europe not being 100% on the side of Ukraine, which is the side of our way of life, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that part of it is that, particularly when we talk about our way of life, this is where the populists are very good, because they will say, oh yeah, well, that's your way of life. You're an elite. You're an educated elite. You benefit from this way of life. But most citizens will tell you that they have not seen an improvement in their way of life, that they feel that they're living in precarious conditions, that redistribution isn't working, welfare isn't working, etc., etc. I mean, I live in France, where we really redistribute a lot. There is a very large and generous social safety net, even though very many people are in difficulties. But even in a place like France, which is, I think, particularly generous, maybe closer to Scandinavian type redistribution than Southern Europe type redistribution, even there is a sense in which the promises have not been delivered. And one of the things that we tend to do, and that the populists never do, one of the things that we tend to do as liberals or progressives in the American sense, is that we try and remind people that actually, no, their life is better. They simply haven't really looked at it properly, which is a very condescending thing to do. How can you complain? Things could be so much worse. But for many people, there are some very basic and very how can I put it, pragmatic issues on which they feel things haven't delivered. But also, I think that there's all of the fears and the imagined fears of that are inculcated by populists on immigration, on insecurity, on the fact that our cities are less safe, that we're just not delivering for them as a community. And I think that those are the harder things to address, right? Because they can be quite easily manipulated. In a sense, we know that the murder rate has gone down in France, but actually, the burglary rate maybe, or the personal burglary rate has gone up. How do you reassure on these issues that are so much about confidence, a collective imaginary, a sense of purpose? This is where we need to, again, this is where we need to to devise a better narrative, right? In the way that the populists have. They're much more convincing than we are.
Yeah, the problem they have, I think, is at the end is then facing reality and doing their own things, because I'm talking about, for example, the Netherlands. There was a populist government, and apparently, they lasted 1 year or more, not much more than that. They were not able to do things because I think if your platform, if your manifesto is make society perfect, then it's very easy to convey and to sustain, but it's very difficult to achieve. When it's up to you then to make things perfect, it becomes much more difficult. And looking, we're talking about Budapest and the change in Budapest, but actually the change in The Hague was as dramatic, I mean, not probably as dramatic as the one in Budapest, but passing, from the populist to the youngest gay progressive prime minister they have now. It's a big change, isn't it?
I think it's a huge change. I think the difference between the Netherlands and the populists in the Netherlands and Orban is, I think that, first of all, this was the first time that there was an actual populist government, because otherwise they'd been supporting other governments, or they'd stayed in opposition and so on and so forth. And it's true that they didn't survive. Now, if I were to play devil's advocate, I would say nobody in the Netherlands has survived, right, over the past 5 years. So in a sense, you could argue that there is such a splintering, such a fragmentation in the Netherlands that it's going to be difficult. But I also think that the difference with Orban is the fact that Orban was extremely critical of Europe, but extremely determined to change it from within. And therefore, to block everything he could block, especially vis-a-vis Ukraine, but at the same time, to always make sure that, that he played a part of the European game, to stay within it. Meloni is different, but, these are people who don't want to leave Europe. These are people who want to stay in, make the most of it, and change what they can. I think that the Dutch populists had a very different view, and my sense is that this is important because when you were saying it's a big change with Orban, well, it's a huge change because even though Magyar is a conservative politician, and even though we know that he will be critical of Europe in some ways, he has lifted his opposition to the 90 billion loan, and he's lifted his opposition to the 20th sanctions package. And that, in a sense, is what Europe was truly after. And so I think that the relief is commensurate with that. Whereas, the Netherlands were never the same kind of bloc as Orban was. So I think that they are quite different. And also because in that short time, Wilders was not able to change the country institutionally, constitutionally, and therefore, again, the fact that we now have a much more promising government in the Netherlands is great, but it's not as big a relief as obviously as Orban.
But do you think the Dutch voters have somehow learned a lesson? I mean, because I'm sure that a lot of progressive, or a lot of ordinary people must have voted for Wilders. Do you think there were expectations they had vis-a-vis him that have been now disappointed? You think that, because then we'll go to Italy, because I'm interested to know what you think. But what do you think about the Netherlands, especially?
I think that I am not sure that the Dutch who voted for Wilders will have learned a lesson, because I think it, as I did just a minute ago, I think it will be very easy to blame a system that prevents you from getting anything done because it is so splintered, and because I think that Wilders may not be the face of Dutch populism going forward. He's been around for a long time. I think that to some extent voters might turn away from Wilders. I don't think that they will necessarily turn away from whatever next incarnation of populism we see in the Netherlands. And, let's not forget that Wilders was not the first one, right? So I think that maybe they've learned a lesson about Wilders. Whether they've learned a lesson about populists in power, I'm not sure.
Well,
the question is whether the Hungarians will have learned a lesson about populists in power.
I have to say, what you're saying about Wilders, I've been thinking it about of Nigel Farage.
Yes.
That after proposing and supporting Brexit, inventing Brexit somehow, and which clearly was a failure, it's still very, very popular in the UK, and have been rather surprised thinking that he already managed to sell a bad product to his own people, and still the same people they seem to be inclined to listen to his promises. That's quite surprising. Don't you think so?
I think it is surprising. I mean, I think Nigel Farage is a very clever politician, and so if you listen to him, what he's telling his voters is that it's not that Brexit was a failure, is that it wasn't properly implemented, right? So, in a way, it's a version of the argument I was making about the Netherlands. It's not me. I didn't have time. The system is rigged. It's still a good idea. But I think that most of these particularly populists like Nigel Farage, like Geert Wilders, they have benefited inordinately from, in many respects, the weakness of the other parties. I mean, Nigel Farage would not be where he is, if the Conservatives hadn't gone through now years of internal fragmentation, of cultural wars, etc. In a sense, he's kind of symptomatic of the weakness of the Conservatives, and also to some extent of the fact that Keir Starmer is trying to manage something that is almost unmanageable. Having picked up after so many years of just catastrophic chaos in the UK, both financially, economically, socially, mismanaged COVID. I mean, it's a perfect storm in the UK, and it's the kind of perfect storm that also legitimates the populists when they say, look, when the elite or mainstream politicians come back into power, they're incompetent, right? But of course, somebody like Starmer is having difficulties because of the unbelievable mess that populists like Boris Johnson left behind, right? So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy.
True. Now let's come a few minutes on Italy, because I know you know Italy. Yes. You work in Florence also. You have an Italian name, so I'm sure you speak Italian also, and I'm sure you're interested. And I know you have written on the Conte one government, the yellow-green government, the one that basically was, probably, in my opinion, is the most populist government we had in Italy, even more populist than the one we have now. But the question for you is, how did you see that government? And also, how do you see things happening in Italy? Because Giorgia Meloni lost the referendum, and suddenly, out of a sudden, she looked much less invincible than she seemed to be. And also, that now there is this new party which has been created on the right hand, on the right wing, vis-a-vis Meloni, because Meloni, during her tenure, she hasn't done much, but clearly there are people who think she could become a sort of a People's Party person. She has become, or she has acted much more moderate than we expected. So what's your general sense?
So, I mean, I think just quickly on the Conte 1 government, I think what was interesting is that we had, I always say that there's no such thing as good populists, right? It's just because they're on the left doesn't make them any more simpatici to me. So I think, it was important to see what a kind of left-wing populist government would do in power, the kind of fragmentation within the Five-Star Movement itself, and also the tendencies within the Five-Star Movement of being an incredibly authoritarian party with very, very little internal democracy. And I think that that's something that we need to remind ourselves about populist parties, whether it's the Rassemblement National here in France, or whether it's the Five-Star Movement, and certainly, a movement like Fidesz. These are actually incredibly authoritarian political machines, right? So it's worth keeping in mind. My interest is more on the Meloni government now. I mean, I think it's very interesting for a number of reasons. First of all, because it clearly looks as though we're in a different Meloni period now, a different Meloni epoch, which is between now and the election. Having lost the referendum, as you say, but also having lost a key ally in Europe in the form of Orban, which is a double-edged sword potentially, because I also think it opens up space for Meloni in Europe on that side of politics. And so, whether she moves towards the EPP and the People's Party almost in order to fill Orban's old shoes, if you like. So she would, in a sense, she would kind of get closer to Europe, which she needs to do because she's having a momentary issue with Trump. So she would be moving closer to Europe, but at the same time, and more into the heart of Europe, potentially with the EPP, which is the majoritarian group, as you know. I think the absence of Orban opens up a lot of things for her. Nevertheless, I think we are looking at somebody who now, having failed this, lost in this referendum, people will be looking at this period of time between now and when the election gets called, and they're going to start looking at what she delivered. And basically, aside from continuity in government, she has delivered nothing, right? Her flagship reform on immigration is in tatters, having cost a lot of money and having delivered nothing. And she has done nothing else, right? And I think, therefore, that even though my sense is that she may very well probably win, she will win in a very different way. She will not win as decisively. And she will probably face an opposition that is now, trying to unite, that will probably be more effective than it has been up until now. So I think that this marks a turn. And it's interesting because if you look at the voting intentions, it's not that she's fallen dramatically. She's gone from 30% to 28%. So this is not a dramatic fall. But nevertheless, there's something symbolic in that. She is not invincible. And the opposition, I think, is seizing this moment to try and be a little bit more cohesive and coherent than it has been so far.
Absolutely. One word on the world champion of Ju-Jitsu, Donald Trump, because I think there literally is using the strengths of liberal democracy to basically overturn it. I was very surprised that the Americans could re-elect someone who had challenged the principle of the principles, which is the orderly transfer of power when you lose an election, and giving back power to someone who basically refused to concede the elections before looked like a dramatic move. And in a way, I thought it was sort of the, let's say, a clue of a genetic mutation of that democracy.
I think you're right. And I mean, okay, he's turning the rules of democracy against itself, but also he's just breaking the law, right? It's just quite easy, right? At this point, I mean, he is the master of the kind of perverted authenticity that I talk about in the book, which is basically somebody who's saying, I am going to do some outrageous things in the name of the people because A, I don't care what the liberal elite thinks, and B, I am going to show you that I will take every kind of risk in the name of what I'm trying to defend and what I'm trying to do for you. And I'm going to be not better than you, I'm going to be just as bad as the worst of you are, which is, really scraping a new low in kind of versions of authenticity. So, I mean, I think you're right that it's surprising that they gave him a second chance. I think there's one thing that we shouldn't underestimate is how badly the last bit of the Biden administration played out, right? I still have this sense in which if Biden had stuck to his promise and had definitely said he wasn't running, and if there had been primaries, and if there had been an orderly succession of candidates on the Democratic Party, then perhaps we wouldn't be in this mess. But I think that was seen as such an egregious betrayal, both of his word and then also of the public, because of a kind of dissimulation of Biden's physical and mental weakness, right? That I think that possibly, gave them an edge. But also, as you say, they violated that rule about the orderly transition of power. But they didn't just violate it, they told a great story for 4 years, right? And they all stuck to that script that the election had been stolen. That's a very simple story that then enables you to demand vengeance, to demand justice. It's our turn. You took something that belonged to me. That idea that it was the others who violated the Constitution, right? Now that's the master Ju-Jitsu move, right? And then you keep the story alive for 4 years. It is proof of the fact that you need a very simple story and you need everyone to tell the same one. Now, I would advocate, let's tell a real story, let's not tell a lie. But I think that it is the power of that narrative, right? A stolen election by somebody who broke his word. That's a very powerful story.
It is. Simple question. Are we, the liberals, the real democrats, are democracies going to win? I mean, at the end, are we well equipped enough to win this fight? Will liberal democracy survive? What do you think?
Look, I still believe that the arc of history tends toward progress, right? So I think it will. I think democracy, a version of democracy, will survive, if only for one reason, which is that we are in a situation in the world today where actually, even though social media have some very dark sides to them, they also have some incredibly positive sides in terms of enabling people to organize, in terms of making sure that that power isn't vested in only the hands of the elite. We really are at a moment where actually the people, however you define them, but the citizens, I would say, have more power at their fingertips potentially than they've ever have had. We're still learning how to use these tools, but I have a certain confidence that eventually we will use them for good. In the short term, I think that we're in for a very bumpy road. And particularly, I think, not particularly because it's more serious, but because I'm closer to it. I think in Europe, we have a set of elections to go through, particularly in France, in Poland, coming up next year, which are going to be determining. If France were to elect someone from the Rassemblement National, be it Marine Le Pen or Jordan Bardella, this is extremely significant for Europe, and so there may be a bumpy ride. But again, I sort of believe that we're learning how to use, tools that can be fundamentally democratic. We're in the process of learning, and I have some faith that after what potentially is a bumpy short term, we can actually use them well and come out of this with a version of democracy that actually does represent minorities, does represent divergent voices, which is important.
We spoke about engagement of people, so the very, very last question is, give us homework. Is there something that our viewers and listeners can do personally, on a personal basis, in order to defend liberal democracy? Any readings, actions, support to a cause, whatever?
My diagnosis is often that, the liberal democracy and certainly representative democracy has suffered because we've tended to fragment and we've tended to polarize, sometimes both in certain countries. It's certainly the case of where I am right now in France. It's both polarized on the far right and far left and also fragmented throughout. And my sense, therefore, that is the most important thing we can do is to continue to participate in groups, not necessarily political groups, but to participate in groups where we are actually able to build ties and develop relationships with people who aren't exactly like us, right? To make sure that we contribute to this pluralism by interacting with people who aren't clones of ourselves. We listen to other opinions. We have different viewpoints. And therefore, I think, continuing to do that, it can be anything. I'm echoing Robert Putnam here, his bowling alone thesis. Join a bowling league, join a political party, join a choir. I think, participating in this kind of civil society makes us aware of our diversity, including the one that we don't like. But even if we don't like it, we can live with it.
It exists.
Sorry?
It exists.
It exists, and we can live with it, right? I don't have to, agree 100% with the person with whom I sing soprano in a choir, but we can do something together, right? Yeah. That is something the most beautiful. Basic.
Something beautiful,
something beautiful together, and we can work together to make it, exist. And I think that is the building block that we need to, reconnect with.
Thank you very much, Catherine Fieschi, for discussing with me. It's been a great pleasure. I hope people will enjoy our conversation as well. And of course, I ask all of them to write their comments below. We will be online on a Saturday morning around 12 noon. I will let you know when. And of course, thank you for listening. And thank you again, Catherine Fieschi, for being with us.
Thank you, Ivan. It was a pleasure. Thank you.